The magnetic storm came without warning, painting the sky of New Terra Colony in sheets of purple and green. Frairen watched from the window of his self-built cabin, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea. At 62, he had seen plenty of storms, but something about this one felt different. Living on the outskirts of the colony suited him. After 30 years of military engineering service, he preferred the quiet company of his tools and machines to the busy streets of the main settlement. His cabin, a mixture of local wood and salvaged spacecraft parts, stood as a testament to human creativity, or stubbornness, as his old commander used to say. The storm grew stronger. Wind howled through the valley, bending the silver-leaf trees that surrounded his home. Frairen's communications panel beeped with colony-wide warning messages, but he paid them little attention. His cabin could weather anything this planet threw at it. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Above the storm's rage came the unmistakable whine of failing engines. Frairen rushed to his observation deck, built from the cockpit of an old shuttle. Through the reinforced windows, he spotted it. A small craft, its hull glowing red from atmospheric entry, spinning out of control. "Not good," he muttered, already reaching for his emergency kit. The craft disappeared behind the tree line, and seconds later, a flash lit up the valley. No explosion followed. A good sign. Frairen pulled on his environment suit, checked its seals, and stepped out into the storm. The magnetic interference made his suit's systems flicker, but he knew these woods well enough to navigate by sight. Following the trail of broken branches and scattered debris, he found the crash site within minutes. The vessel was unlike anything he had seen in his military days. Its organic curves and pearly surface reminded him more of a seashell than a spacecraft. Steam rose where rain hit its still hot hull, and a dim light pulsed from within, a sign that some systems still worked. Looking for an entry point, Frairen circled the craft. He found what appeared to be a hatch, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Years of engineering experience told him where to place his tools, and after a few attempts, the hatch slid open. Inside, the air was thick with sweet-smelling smoke. Frairen's suit sensors indicated no immediate dangers, but he kept his helmet sealed just in case. The craft's interior was small, barely large enough for 2 people, and filled with what looked like carefully stored plants and scientific equipment. In the pilot's seat, he found her. The alien was slumped forward, unconscious but breathing. Her skin had a pale blue tint, and delicate patterns that looked like frost on a window decorated her face. She was humanoid, but definitely not human. Her fingers were too long, her features too angular. "Hey," Frairen said, knowing she probably couldn't understand him. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The alien stirred at his voice. Her eyes opened, all 3 of them, revealing pupils that sparkled like starlight. She spoke, her voice musical but filled with pain, in a language his suit's computer couldn't translate. Frairen pointed to himself, then to his cabin visible through the ship's cracked viewport. The alien's eyes followed his gesture, and she nodded slowly. Every movement seemed to cause her pain, but she helped as best she could as he carefully lifted her from the seat. The storm had grown worse, but Frairen's cabin wasn't far. By the time they reached it, the alien was shivering violently. He brought her to his workshop, the warmest room in the cabin thanks to his countless machines. As he helped her onto a cot, she pulled something from a pouch at her waist, a small device that projected holographic text. The words were garbled, but he could make out. "Thank Rimiki, scientist." "Frairen," he replied, pointing to himself. "You're safe here." She smiled weakly, her patterns glowing faintly in the workshop's light. Frairen didn't know much about alien biology, but he knew shock when he saw it. He covered her with a thermal blanket and set about making his strange guest comfortable. As he worked, Frairen glanced at the storm outside. In 30 years of military service, he'd never encountered a situation quite like this. But somehow, watching Miss Rimiki rest while the storm raged on, He felt he was exactly where he needed to be. Morning came with clearer skies and countless questions. Frairen had spent the night tinkering with broken translation devices from his military days, hoping to fix one enough to properly communicate with his guest. Miss Rimiki, as he now knew to call her, sat quietly observing him work, her 3 eyes tracking his every movement with obvious curiosity. The workshop's cluttered shelves fascinated her. Every few minutes, she would point at something. An old engine part, a forgotten tool, or one of his half-finished projects, and make a musical sound that he assumed was a question. Frairen would then demonstrate what the object did, which usually led to her making excited notes on her holographic device. "Almost got it," Frairen mumbled, adjusting the final connections in the translator. He'd combined parts from 3 different devices and added some modifications of his own. It wasn't pretty, but it might work. When he switched it on, the device hummed to life, its status light glowing a promising green. Miss Rimiki's patterns brightened when he handed her the translator. She held it carefully, running her long fingers over its makeshift casing. When she spoke, the device crackled for a moment before producing words in a soft, slightly mechanical voice. "Your skills with machines are remarkable," it translated. "Among my people, the Lumi, such repairs would take a team of specialists several days." Frairen shrugged, trying to hide his satisfaction that the device worked. Engineers in the military had to learn to fix things quickly, sometimes with whatever we could find. He gestured to her holographic device. "Your technology seems far more advanced than ours." Her pattern shifted to a lighter shade of blue. "Different, not better. We Lumi focus on living technology, growing our devices instead of building them. But this has limitations." She paused, her expression becoming worried. "Like my ship, the damage is extensive, and far from any Lumi growth gardens that could repair it." "I could take a look," Frairen offered. "Might not understand all of it, but damage is damage." Together, they walked to the crash site, the morning sun revealing the full extent of the problem. The ship's beautiful hull was cracked in several places, its organic materials already beginning to deteriorate without proper care. Miss Rimiki made a sound that the translator didn't need to interpret. It was clearly distress. "The ship is dying," she explained. "And my samples." She rushed inside through the open hatch. Frairen followed, ducking to fit through the alien doorway. In the light of day, he could now see that what he'd thought were simple plants were actually sophisticated specimens, each housed in a crystalline container. "These are rare healing flowers from 7 different worlds," Miss Rimiki said, checking each container carefully. "My people believe they could help cure diseases across many species, including humans, but without proper care." She gestured to one container where the plant inside was already wilting. Frairen scratched his chin thoughtfully. The ship might be beyond saving, but the plants. He looked around his property, mind already working on solutions. "I have some spare parts. With some modifications, we might be able to build them a shelter. Not as fancy as your ship, but it would keep them alive." Miss Rimiki's pattern swirled with new colors. "You would help, but you don't know me or my people." "Don't need to," Frairen replied, already measuring distances in his mind. "You're here, you need help, and I can provide it. That's enough." He turned to her with a slight smile. "Besides, I've been looking for a good project. It's too quiet out here sometimes." The translator crackled as it processed her response. "The Lumi have stories about humans. They say you are unpredictable, sometimes dangerous." She moved closer, her patterns glowing warmly. "But they also say you are capable of great kindness. I see now they were right about the second part." Frairen felt his face flush at the praise. "Well, let's see if they're right about humans being clever too. We got some plants to save." He started walking back to his workshop, already listing in his mind the materials they'd need. Behind him, Miss Rimiki followed, her steps lighter than before, her patterns shimmering with what he was beginning to recognize as hope. The winter winds of New Terra howled outside as Frairen and Miss Rimiki worked in his workshop, They had spent 3 days salvaging useful parts from her crashed ship, racing against both the approaching cold season and the deterioration of her precious plant samples. The workshop table was covered with an odd mixture of human tools and Lumi technology. "These power cells are amazing," Frairen said, carefully examining a glowing crystal from the ship's engine. "They're alive, aren't they? Like your plants." Miss Rimiki nodded, her patterns rippling with what he now recognized as pride. "All Lumi technology grows from living crystals. They are delicate but powerful." She touched the crystal gently, and it pulsed in response. "But they need specific conditions to maintain their energy. The cold coming to your world will kill them, just like it will kill my samples." Frairen spread out his rough sketches on the table. The greenhouse design he'd created combined salvaged parts from Miss Rimiki's ship with his own stored materials. It wasn't pretty, but it might work. "If we use the living crystals to power the heating system, and your ship's hull panels for the walls, the crystals won't last long enough," Miss Rimiki interrupted, her patterns dimming with worry. "I can feel the cold growing stronger each day. Even now, my samples weaken." She gestured to the crystalline containers, where several of the plants had started to droop. Frairen stood up and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of his workshop. He'd hoped to avoid using these, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Inside were 3 small fusion cores, extremely rare and expensive emergency power sources he'd kept from his military days. "What if we combine technologies?" he suggested, placing one of the cores on the table. "Your crystals handle the delicate work of maintaining the right conditions, while my fusion cores provide the raw power to keep everything running through the winter." Miss Rimiki's 3 eyes widened as she studied the fusion core. "This is dangerous technology. My people would never risk using something so unstable." "Sometimes the riskiest tools are the ones that save us," Frairen replied, remembering old lessons from his military years. "I know how to handle these safely. Trust me." Her pattern swirled for a moment before settling into a determined configuration. "I trust you, Frairen. You have shown nothing but kindness since finding me. What do you need me to do?" They worked through the day and into the night, Frairen handling the heavy construction, while Miss Rimiki carefully integrated her living technology with his mechanical systems. The greenhouse took shape behind his cabin, a strange but beautiful fusion of human and Lumi engineering. As they worked, Miss Rimiki taught him about her people's way of caring for plants. She demonstrated their bioharmonics, singing soft, crystal-clear notes that made the plants respond visibly. Frairen found himself humming along, though his rough voice made her laugh rather than affect the plants. The real test came when they transferred the first sample to the greenhouse. The plant, a delicate blue flower with glowing petals, had been the weakest of the collection. Miss Rimiki placed it carefully in the prepared soil while Frairen activated the combined power systems. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the flower's petals began to lift, its glow strengthening in the carefully regulated environment. Miss Rimiki's patterns burst into bright, joyful colors. "It's working," she exclaimed, her translator barely keeping up with her excited words. "The temperature, the light, the energy field, everything is perfect." Frairen allowed himself a small smile as he checked the power readings. The fusion core and crystal combination was working better than he'd hoped, creating a stable environment that would last through the winter. "We still have much work to do," he said, looking at the remaining samples waiting to be transferred. "But we've proved it's possible. Human and Lumi technology, working together." Miss Rimiki touched his arm gently, her patterns creating beautiful reflections on the greenhouse walls. "Not just the technology, Frairen. Us too. We make a good team." Outside, the winter winds grew stronger, but inside the greenhouse, hope bloomed alongside the saved plants. Frairen looked at their creation. Not quite human, not quite Lumi, but something new and wonderful, and knew they had built something far more important than just a shelter for plants. 2 weeks had passed since they built the greenhouse, and life had fallen into a comfortable routine. Every morning, Frairen would wake early to check the fusion cores, making small adjustments to keep them running smoothly. He would find Miss Rimiki already in the greenhouse, singing to her plants in the crystalline tones of her people. Today, she was teaching him about the healing properties of a silver-veined flower that sparkled like starlight. On my world, we call this the dreamer's breath, she explained, her patterns shifting to match the flower's glow. It helps those who have lost their way find peace in sleep. Frairen watched as she demonstrated the proper way to care for it, her long fingers moving with practiced grace. "Reminds me of the night I found you," he said quietly. "The way your ship looked in the storm, like a fallen star." Miss Rimiki's patterns rippled with what he now knew was amusement. "And you, the gruff human hermit, came to rescue me." She adjusted the crystal regulators near the plant. "My people would never believe that one of their scientists now lives in a cabin made of wood and spaceship parts." "Speaking of your people," Frairen said, checking a gauge on the nearest fusion core, "won't they be looking for you?" Her patterns dimmed slightly. "The magnetic storm damaged my communications array. Even if I could rebuild it, the winter interference would make it impossible to send a clear signal." She touched one of her plants gently. "But it's not all bad. This time has taught me much about humans." "About you?" Frairen raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what have you learned about us humans?" "That you are far more than the stories tell," she said, her translator carrying the warmth in her voice. "We Lumi pride ourselves on growing everything we need, on living in harmony with nature. But you humans, you build, you adapt, you take broken things and make them whole again." She gestured around the greenhouse. "Look at what you did here. You took parts of my dying ship and your own precious resources and created something new. Something beautiful." Her pattern swirled with bright colors. "And you did it not for profit or glory, but simply because someone needed help." Frairen felt his face grow warm at her words. "Well, you've taught me plenty too. Never thought I'd see plants respond to singing, for one thing." He chuckled. "Though mine seems to make them wilt faster." Miss Rimiki laughed, the sound like chiming bells. "Your voice is unique, but it's not about the sound itself. Bioharmonics is about the intention, the connection between caregiver and plant." She moved closer to him. "Here, let me show you." She took his weathered hands in her delicate ones, positioning them near a young plant with purple leaves. "Close your eyes," she instructed. "Feel its energy, its life force. Now hum whatever tune comes to your heart." Feeling slightly foolish but willing to try, Frairen closed his eyes. He thought about his life before finding Miss Rimiki. The quiet days alone, the satisfaction of working with his hands, the peace of his self-imposed solitude. Then he thought about how different things were now, how his workshop and greenhouse had come alive with her presence, her songs, her stories. Without realizing it, he began to hum an old Spacer's tune his mother used to sing. Miss Rimiki's voice joined his, her crystalline tones weaving through his deeper notes. To his amazement, when he opened his eyes, the plant's leaves were gently swaying, its color deepening to a rich royal purple. "You see," Miss Rimiki said softly, her patterns glowing with joy, "you may build with metal and wire, but you understand life just as we do. You simply express it differently." Frairen looked at their hands, still joined near the thriving plant. "Maybe that's what both our peoples need to learn," he said thoughtfully. "That there's more than one way to care for things and people." Outside, the winter winds continued to blow, but inside the greenhouse, something rare and precious was growing alongside the healing plants, a friendship that bridged the stars themselves. The first warning came as a flicker in the greenhouse lights. Frairen noticed it while doing his evening maintenance check, a slight dimming that shouldn't have happened with their backup systems. He was about to mention it to Miss Rimiki when his emergency communicator crackled to life with a colony-wide alert. "Attention all residents," the message blared. "The primary power grid is experiencing critical failures due to extreme magnetic interference. All non-essential systems will be shut down. Expect rolling blackouts across all sectors." This is not a drill. Miss Rimiki's patterns pulsed with concern as she looked at their precious plants. How long will our backup power last? Frairen was already checking the fusion core's readings. The numbers made his heart sink. The cores are straining. The magnetic interference is affecting them more than it should. He showed her the declining power curves. At this rate, we have maybe 2 days before total failure. 2 days. Her patterns flickered in distress. But the plants, some of these specimens are the last of their kind. If we lose power now, we lose everything. Frairen moved from gauge to gauge, his experienced eyes searching for solutions. The combination of human and Lumi technology had worked beautifully until now, but the magnetic storms were proving stronger than anyone had predicted. What about the living crystals? He asked, remembering how they powered Miss Rimiki's ship. Could we use more of those? She shook her head, her patterns dimming. The remaining crystals are too weak. The cold has affected them despite our best efforts. She paused, then her patterns shifted to a deep, determined blue. But there might be another way. Frairen recognized the tone in her voice, the same one he'd heard in fellow soldiers about to do something dangerously selfless. What are you thinking? The plants themselves, she said quietly. Specifically, the moonfire lilies we saved. Their energy signature is similar to our power crystals. If we process them correctly, they could power the greenhouse for the rest of the winter. But those lilies, Frairen protested, they're part of your research. The ones you said could help cure neural diseases. Yes, her pattern swirled with complex emotions the translator couldn't capture. But if we lose power, all the plants die anyway. At least this way, we save the others. Frairen walked to the workbench where he kept his tools. No, he said firmly. There has to be another way. You didn't come across half the galaxy to lose your most important samples to a power failure. He began pulling out parts, spare capacitors, old power cells, bits and pieces he collected over the years. His military training kicked in, mind racing through possibilities. The magnetic storms are actually a form of energy, if we could harness it somehow. Miss Rimiki moved closer, her patterns brightening with interest. Like how the dreamleaf plants absorb starlight. She pointed to a row of softly glowing blue flowers. They convert one form of energy to another. Exactly. Frairen grabbed his sketching pad. We're thinking too small. Instead of fighting the magnetic interference, what if we used it? His pencil flew across the paper as he drew. We could build collectors, like lightning rods but for magnetic energy, route it through a converter, and use the living crystals to stabilize the flow. Miss Rimiki's patterns sparkled with excitement. The crystals wouldn't need to provide power, just guide it. They worked through the night, Frairen handling the physical construction, while Miss Rimiki adapted her remaining crystals to their new purpose. The magnetic storms grew stronger, making tools float and causing their hair to stand on end. But they kept working. As dawn approached, they had 6 collectors installed around the greenhouse, each one crackling with captured energy. Inside, Miss Rimiki's crystals hummed as they channeled the wild magnetic forces into usable power. The lights in the greenhouse steadied, then brightened. The temperature regulators came back online at full strength. Around them, the plants seemed to glow with renewed vigor, responding to the unique energy flowing through their environment. It's more than working, Miss Rimiki whispered, her patterns radiating joy. The plants are thriving on this new energy. They're adapting, growing stronger. Frairen checked the final readings, allowing himself a tired smile. Sometimes the biggest problems give us the best solutions. We just have to be willing to look at them differently. Through the greenhouse windows, they could see lights flickering across the colony. But in their own little corner of New Terra, an impossible combination of human ingenuity and Lumi wisdom had turned a crisis into a triumph. News of their success spread quickly through the colony. While other sectors struggled with power shortages, the mysterious greenhouse on the outskirts remained a beacon of light in the magnetic storms. It didn't take long for colony officials to come investigating. Governor Mills arrived with a team of engineers one snowy morning. Frairen watched from his cabin porch as their vehicles made their way up the winding path. Miss Rimiki stood beside him, her patterns shifting between nervous purple and excited gold. "They won't try to take the greenhouse, will they?" she asked quietly. "My people, we are still new to relationships with humans. We prefer to keep our technology private." Frairen shook his head. "Don't worry. I still have some influence from my military days. Besides," he smiled slightly, "what we built isn't just Lumi technology anymore. It's something new." The governor was a practical woman who had weathered many crises in the colony's history. She listened intently as Frairen explained their magnetic energy collectors and watched with obvious amazement as Miss Rimiki demonstrated how the living crystals channeled and refined the power. "Remarkable," Governor Mills said, studying the thriving plants. "While the rest of the colony struggles with blackouts, you've not only maintained power but created something that could revolutionize how we handle the magnetic storms." She turned to Miss Rimiki. "Your people's technology, combined with human engineering, it's extraordinary." Miss Rimiki's patterns glowed with pride. "Frairen deserves most of the credit. He saw the possibility when I was ready to sacrifice my research. He showed me that sometimes the best solution comes from embracing what seems impossible." The governor's team spent hours documenting everything, taking readings, and making detailed notes. One of the engineers, an older woman who had served with Frairen in the military, pulled him aside. "You always were good at improvising solutions," she said. "But this is beyond anything I've seen. The colony's research division would love to have you back, you know. Both of you." Frairen watched Miss Rimiki explaining bioharmonics to a fascinated young engineer. "We'll think about it, but this greenhouse needs us. These plants—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're more than just specimens now. They're a bridge between our peoples." Later that afternoon, they received another surprise visit. A Lumi research vessel, sleek and beautiful like Miss Rimiki's crashed ship, descended from the clouds. 3 Lumi scientists emerged, their patterns displaying complex swirls of emotion when they saw Miss Rimiki. "We detected your modified energy signature," the lead scientist explained through a translator. "We feared something had gone wrong with your mission. Instead, we find—" He gestured to the greenhouse, his patterns showing amazement. "This is unlike anything in our records." Miss Rimiki led them through the greenhouse, explaining how they had adapted Lumi technology to work with human engineering. The scientists' patterns shifted from skepticism to interest to genuine excitement as they saw how the plants had flourished under the hybrid system. "The magnetic storms," one scientist noted, "they would have destroyed a traditional Lumi growth chamber. Yet these plants are thriving. They've grown stronger, more resilient." He turned to Frairen. "Perhaps we have been too rigid in our thinking, too afraid to combine our knowledge with others." The governor, who had stayed to meet the Lumi scientists, saw an opportunity. "Why not make this official? We could establish a joint research station here, study how to combine our technologies, our methods, our understanding." The Lumi scientists' patterns rippled with consideration. Miss Rimiki moved to stand beside Frairen, her patterns glowing with hope. "It would mean staying longer," she said softly, "if you wouldn't mind the company." Frairen looked at his cabin, at the greenhouse they had built together, at the unlikely family of humans and Lumi gathering in his once lonely corner of Nuterra. "I think," he said with a smile, "that's the best idea I've heard since a certain ship crashed in my backyard." Outside, the magnetic storms continued to swirl in Nuterra's skies, but they were no longer a threat. Instead, they had become the power source for something unprecedented, a place where 2 very different peoples could learn from each other, grow together, and discover that the best solutions often came from the most unexpected friendships. Spring came to Nuterra colony, melting the winter snows and bringing new life to the landscape. The magnetic storms had calmed, but the greenhouse still hummed with energy, now expanded to 3 times its original size. Where Frairen's cabin had once stood alone, A small but bustling research station had grown around it. Frairen sat in his favorite chair on the cabin's porch, watching young human and Lumi researchers hurrying between buildings. His old workshop had become a classroom where he taught human engineering principles to curious Lumi scientists. The sight still amazed him sometimes, how one crashed ship and a winter storm had changed everything. Miss Rimiki emerged from the greenhouse, her patterns glowing with the deep satisfaction of a successful experiment. "The new hybrid plants are ready," she announced, sitting beside him. "They carry the healing properties of my original samples, but now they're strong enough to grow in almost any environment." Her patterns sparkled with amusement. "Like us, better together than apart." "Speaking of better together," Frairen said, reaching for a small box he'd kept hidden behind his chair. "I've been working on something. A thank you for changing my life." He handed her the box, his weathered hands slightly shaky with nervousness. Inside was a delicate device that looked like a cross between a music box and a crystal garden. When Miss Rimiki opened it, it began to play the Spacer's tune Frairen had hummed that day in the greenhouse, but with a twist. The sound resonated through tiny living crystals, creating the perfect harmony of human melody and Lumi bioharmonics. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her patterns flowing with emotions too complex for the translator to capture. "You combined our technologies just to make music." "Well," Frairen smiled, "you taught me that sometimes the most important things can't be measured or studied. Sometimes they just need to be felt." He pointed to a small crystal at the center of the device. "That's from your ship's control panel. I've been saving it for something special." A group of children ran past, human kids from the colony playing with young Lumi who had come with their researcher parents. They were playing some mixed-up game that combined human tag with Lumi pattern matching, their laughter bridging any cultural gaps. "Did you ever think," Miss Rimiki asked, watching the children play, "when you found me in that storm, that we'd end up creating all this?" Frairen shook his head. "I was too busy trying to figure out how to keep your plants alive." He looked out at the research station, at the greenhouse where it all began. "But that's the funny thing about life, isn't it? The best things grow from the smallest seeds." A soft chime sounded from the main research building. Time for the daily shared meal where humans and Lumi gathered to exchange stories and ideas. It had become a tradition, one that helped bind their growing community together. "We should join them," Miss Rimiki said, carefully placing the music box on a shelf inside the cabin door. "The governor is visiting today. She says other colonies want to establish their own joint research stations." "Let them wait a minute," Frairen replied, enjoying the peaceful moment. "I spent too many years rushing around. Now I know better." He looked at his friend, her patterns glowing with the same contentment he felt. "Sometimes you need to stop and appreciate how far you've come." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their impossible dream flourish around them. The greenhouse that had saved Miss Rimiki's plants now housed hundreds of species, each one a potential cure or breakthrough. The power system they'd created in desperate times now helped light homes across the colony. And their friendship, born in a storm, had opened doors neither species knew existed. "You know," Frairen said finally, standing up and offering his hand to help Miss Rimiki rise. "For a retired hermit and a crashed scientist, we didn't do too badly." Miss Rimiki's patterns danced with joy as she took his hand. "No," she agreed, her translator carrying the warmth in her voice. "We did something better. We proved that the universe's greatest gifts often come disguised as accidents." Together, they walked toward the dining hall, their shadows merging in the setting sun. Behind them, the music box played softly, its melody carrying across the grounds, a song of friendship that had started with a storm and grown into a symphony of two worlds.